or one of the volunteers, can you tell me if we're all good to go for the live stream? I think probably other people are checking it too. But I'm not hearing a response, so. Green, good. Okay, got it. All right, I'm just going to make a few opening remarks, and we have time this morning to do a bit of testing. But before we start doing that testing, I want to apologize for all of our glitches yesterday. We all discovered that software doesn't always work. Amazing. So it doesn't work all the time, but we did get some things done, and we're happy about it. Just to keep us on our toes, one of our servers at DigiPen went down, or was inaccessible for some reason, and so I did have to repost the PDF schedules, which we're constantly kind of correcting and updating. So I reposted those on a Google page, and those should be available on the main website as well now. So please go there and refresh those pages, and you should find those documents there. All right, so this morning, we only have one slide deck up here. Lawrence is going to talk a little bit about the panel discussion with Valve today. But before we do that, we want to try to make sure that all of the people in all of the rooms are seeing the right thing, and then we're going to test the video and see if you're hearing and seeing the video playing. So Lawrence, do you want to just take over with that?
Sure. Can everybody hear me? Can I get some emojis? Okay. Can anybody not hear me? Could I get a negative, a little sad face? No sad faces. Oh, that makes me happy. Well, wait a minute. That means that I should do this then. I should do this. Yeah. Thank you all for being here. If my host panel tools are correct, it looks like 20, 40, 60. We got about 70 to 80 people, and it's scattered across four of our cloned rooms. And Matt mentioned this yesterday, that these rooms are using AltSpace's front row feature, so they're mirrored over there, and we have issues of being on air so that you can see us all. I'm curious, did our panelists, the folks from Valve, did you make it here? I guess I'll only see the people who are in this room, but I hope you all made it here. Yeah, there's a few. I see some hearts. Is that oh, that's somebody else. Oh, actually, it's interesting. I see hearts. Oh, that's cool. I'm seeing like a little blank space, and then the emojis come up. So I see your emojis even though I don't see you. That's interesting. Okay, well, Matt, there we learned something about front row every moment.
Too. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, well, you're ahead of me as usual. So I wanted to introduce our event, our plenary panel discussion today. Can you all see that on the screen? Is that When Worlds Collide, audio development of the Valve Index and Half-Life Alyx? Yeah. Let me pull up my notes. This was a hectic morning, Matt. This was a crazy morning. Let me just pull up this here, because I'm not. There we go. Valve panel. Matt, talk to the crowd for a second. I've got to pull up my notes. He's probably doing email too.
Yeah,
my
no
bad.
worries. No. As I said, we're going to do a little bit of testing. Usually, Dustin is on deck there to reset spaces in other rooms, but I think I'm leaving that to Dustin to monitor those. But I think we can have that open discussion now. And Dustin, if you want to amplify and let me know if you need to reset any of those rooms, are we good to go seeing everything in there?
We're good to go. I reset everything already.
Great. Okay, and we have reset
Cool.
this space.
Hey,
just
I found my
before 9.
notes, so that's kind of nice.
So I think we probably can proceed, but I did want to do
Can we proceed?
The video
Sure.
test too, though.
Yeah, well, let's do that. So, but I'm going to do this as if it's my presentation, because the video is coming up in just the next slide. So some of you, many of you are familiar with Valve Corporation, but some of you may not be. And so they're our neighbor here in Bellevue, Washington. We're in Redmond. at DigiPen. But Valve's next door, and I thought I'd just say a few words about them before we all head over to the AVAR Panels event in a little bit for today's panel discussion with the Valve audio team. Last summer, Valve released its new VR headset, the Index, and then in May they released Half-Life Alyx, a virtual reality first-person shooter cited by some critics as VR's first killer app. And what we've got here for you now is a video. It's about 2.5 minutes long. And if you're wearing headphones, which I hope you are, you will hear the audio. This is actual gameplay footage. So it wasn't doctored up in post-production. This is actually from the VR game Half-Life Alyx. And I'd like you all to let me know. So I'm going to hit play now. And if you could give me happy emojis if you can see the video and hear it. All right, I'm seeing sad face emojis, Matt, so I got to stop it. So,
Yeah, I think most of those are coming, looks like they're coming from other rooms. So let's see if Dustin wants to try a reset again in the other rooms.
and Matt, I think oh, actually, yeah, we can just pick up because it's a long enough video. We can pick up where we left off.
Okay, I see that Dustin has disappeared in the top row, and that means he's
Okay.
probably going to the other rooms to reset. So apologies to all of those of you who could see it and don't see the reason for a pause here, but I think it's worth it to check on those other rooms quickly. And yeah, just to see
I'm
if
curious
get that
now for the
sorted out.
for the folks in here, and sorry, this is again the price we pay for being on the bleeding edge. Could I get a show of happy emojis for people who saw it and it was playing fine and sounding fine? Oh wow, okay, so that looks, oh, a bunch of people. Oh, you guys made my
Everybody.
morning.
Yeah.
I feel better now. Okay, so but I don't mean to diss the people who couldn't see it. So let's see if we can get this sorted out. And then we'll just do the best we can. So we'll wait a minute for Dustin to flit through cyberspace into all the mirrored rooms, resetting spaces, spreading fairy dust and happiness wherever he goes. I should mention that when we go over to AVAR panels, we thought this was a downside, but now I'm thinking it's an upside. We will not be showing any videos in the panel discussion. There is a projector screen where we'll show some still images, just one or two, but we won't have media issues there. It'll just be hearing our panelists, and we've tested them.
Go ahead, Lawrence.
Okay.
Sorry to interrupt. Dustin just said he
Sure.
can see it in all the other rooms, so I think we're good to go for another test.
Okay, I'm gonna hit play, and it'll pick up where it left off. So let's see it. Let's see how it goes. Okay, well, thank you guys. There you go. There's our there's our test. Um, I think what we'll do, Matt, unless you feel otherwise, I'm just going to continue on with my introduction to the talk, rather than trying to mess around with video anymore. What do you say?
Yeah, I think so. I think we did have some persistent problems in the other rooms, but I think we've done about all we know how to do to address that, and we do need to move on. It apparently was good in the live stream as well. So yeah,
Ye-
let's just move
Oh,
on.
good. Okay. Yeah, and I know somebody I think in this room said they were getting garbled in here, but anyway, it is what it is. I should mention that you can watch that video. That's a public video. It's on the Half-Life Alyx website. So anyway, let me talk a little bit more about what we're the panel discussion we're about to hear. In her deep dive article on the development of the index's ear speakers, Emily Ridgway explains how research and playtesting led the team to understand that achieving maximum sonic immersion enforced as many constraints on the design of the audio components of the index as it did on the 3D tracking system or the display panels. The team also learned that designing around those constraints, it meant accepting trade-offs that affected everything from the position of the speakers, the weight of the driver, the shape of the diaphragm, to the design of the enclosure and the frequency response of the speakers themselves. In her article, which I highly recommend, and again, you can find it, it's on Valve Deep Dive ear speakers. Just look for Google Index Deep Dive ear speakers. There's a series of articles all about the development, but in particular Emily's article on the ear speakers. She goes on to say that audio immersion could only be achieved by relying simultaneously on the domains of both software and hardware. And I think this is key for all of us who develop software, especially for games. I was the audio director at Nintendo Software Technology for 12 years and working on everything from the original Game Boy Color to the DS and the GameCube. That marriage of hardware and software from a developer standpoint and from a content creator standpoint is quite complex. And that's one of the things that Emily speaks about. She says, knowing where to draw the line between the responsibilities of audio device hardware and game software required a holistic consideration of the entire VR audio pipeline, from how VR content is created, how VR sound content is created, to how it is output by game engines, and to all the ways that it can reach the ear. So in reviewing these trade-offs, it became apparent to Emily and her team that the optimal solution for VR from their position might be a pair of ultra near-field, full-range, off-ear or extra-aural headphones or ear speakers, close enough to the ear to mimic player-relative stereo headphones and to support the output format of current VR content, but far enough away to allow the ears and head to imprint their own tonal coloration onto the sound, while also addressing comfort and pressure issues. And if you listen to any of the papers and workshops in this conference, it's really fascinating to sort of meld this all together and see how that's such a holistic impact. So hopefully that gives you some context for the panel discussion with the Valve team, which will be moderated by Scott Selfon of Facebook Reality Labs. Scott, are you here in the main room here? Can you give me a heart emoji, or maybe you're in a cloned room? There he is. Oh no, he's a green circle, so you're in another room. Anyway, Scott's going to be the moderator of the panel, and you can get to AVAR panels, which is in your events, my events menu. So I say, Matt, unless you have any further suggestions or comments, I say let's head on over to AVAR panels and have our panel discussion.
Yeah, let's go ahead and do that. I think we have a little bit of a pause, about maybe a 10-minute break before we actually start the panel, and
Great.
that will
Well,
also
maybe we can chat.
The panel will be streamed also as part of the same stream that you're seeing in here. Just people were asking about that as well. So
Right. So you can find the live stream on AVAR2020 or the AES website. There's links to that, and this what we just talked about and the panel discussion will all be on the same streaming link for the plenary session for day 2.
All right.
Yeah, that's it. So
see you
let's
over in panels.
see you over in AVAR panels. Thank you all.
we should build a VR headset of our own, all the way to actually shipping it into market. And the same for sort of a hero piece of software that runs on top of it and sort of celebrates the audio capabilities, which is what we'll be talking about today, Half-Life Alyx and the Valve Index. So if folks want to take a look at that, that'll give you a little sense also of when some of the people who are here up on stage first popped into and became part of this project. So take a look, and we'll go ahead and get started for reels at around 9:30.
Excellent. Well, we've done all our tests. Should we start 2 minutes early?
My clock says it's 1 minute early, so I think we can start.
Yeah, let's
we
just do
have
it.
we are jam-packed with information for today, so I want
Let's do
to try
it.
and get as much time as possible, and it looks like our audience wants it as well. So let's go ahead and get started. This is
Thanks, Scott.
sure. This is the panel When Worlds Collide, Audio Development of the Valve Index and Half-Life Alyx. I have an amazing team of folks who worked on the Index, who worked on Half-Life Alyx, many of them at the same time. This is kind of a unique opportunity for us to interview and get to talk with and understand what happens when the hardware and software are kind of on the same flight path. Obviously, they diverged a little bit at the end. Alyx got a little bit of extra time, but for a long time, they were being co-developed, and I think that's a really unique perspective, and that's what I'm hoping we can get a lot of information about today. So with that, I'd love for our panelists to introduce themselves, talk about who you are, what your involvement was with these two projects, and when you were involved. We have the timeline up behind us, so this is kind of our opportunity to refer to it, and then we'll switch back to the pictures of our real faces after we have these introductions. So take it away, Joy.
Hello, can you guys hear me? Hopefully.
Yes.
All right, great. Yeah, so my name is Joy Lyons. I'm actually a senior director of audio technology at Harman, but prior to this, my current position, I worked on the Valve Index. So I came to it a little bit late. A lot of the audio architecture from a hardware standpoint had been developed, and I think Emily will address that. But my background is academically, I have degrees in physics and music and acoustics, and I've worked in consumer products and hardware and sort of signal processing development for the last, well, I won't say how long, but quite some time. And so I have some research experience in HRTFs and in sound propagation, and then also from signal processing development, both on the sort of binaural and rendering side, but then also specifically to the hardware and hardware tuning. And so my role is I came in and I did a once-over on an existing system, and I sort of tuned a lot of the components, made sure everything was in tip-top shape to make sure that it was a really neutral base to play back spatial audio. And then I also did a test system, end-of-line quality control, automated tests to go through and make sure that every product that actually shipped was actually delivering on the design intent. So with that, I'll hand it off.
Thank you, Joy. Go ahead, Robin.
Hi, my name is Robin Walker. Out of everyone up here, I'm the one who knows absolutely the least about audio. I'm a game designer and programmer. If you're up here on the timeline, in the 2016 green section in the middle is when which was the internal name for the product that eventually became Half-Alyx. I've just lost tracking. Oh, there we go. Yeah, so on Alyx, my focus was on mostly, almost entirely gameplay code, focusing on artificial intelligence, the enemies and stuff like that. I also did a chunk of the leadership responsibilities on it, which tend to get shared around at Valve. Yeah, so that's it for me.
Thank you, Robin. Next up is Emily Ridgway.
Hey guys, can you hear me okay?
Yes, indeed.
All right, sweet. My name is Emily Ridgway. I've been at Valve for the last 7 years now, which seems pretty crazy to me. I'm a part of the audio team at Valve, which basically just means that you cover anything that is related to making a sound. That's your problem and your fault. So for the last 7 years, I've been working on Counter-Strike. I've been working on VR hardware. I was responsible for prototyping and sort of championing the off-ear speaker design on the Index VR system. Most recently, I helped ship Half-Life Alyx as a writer and sound designer, and also just sort of helping out the main audio team and Dave Pfizer and the rest of the audio team that were working on that project as well. My background is as a traditional sort of creative sound designer and audio director. And it isn't until I came to Valve that I actually started working in a more sort of technical domain on hardware and dabbling a bit in programming as well, which has been awesome. So yeah, that's my rough history and at Valve, and I'll pass it over to Dave.
Great. Thank you, Emily. Next up, we've got David. David, can you introduce yourself as well, please?
Hey, good morning, everybody. Can y'all hear me out there? My name's Dave Faiza. I've been at Valve for, I think, 11 years now, which seems long to me, but in Valve time, it's actually pretty short. I joined the Half-Life Alyx team pretty early on, like spring of 2016, I think. I was the first audio person on the team. I got recruited by another Valve employee, Greg Coomer, at the launch party for the lab, and he said I should talk to Robin to see what he was doing. So I did a lot of the sound effects work on Half-Life Alyx, a lot of scripting and code writing as far as working with the index. My role is mostly testing and feedback. I worked a lot more with Anish and the Steam Audio people than I did on the hardware side. Prior to Valve, I was at Electronic Arts for 5 years, but mostly my background is in sound design and music production. I'm done now.
That's you, Anish.
Okay, all right. Hi there.
It's moderating itself now.
Yeah, I think we're moderating ourselves now. Okay, so hi, my name is Anish Chandak. I am a software engineer at Valve. I work on something called Steam Audio, which is a spatial audio software that we release. I joined, the timeline's not here, but I joined Valve late 2016. Before that, I was working at a company called Impulsonic. After joining Valve, I worked with Emily and David White on Counter-Strike, adding spatial audio to CSGO basically for a year and a half. And around 2018 is when I joined Half-Life Alyx teams, when it was going to release in like a year's time frame. So we had like very little time to add a ton of features, but that ended up being extended. So my main responsibilities on Half-Life Alyx was integrating spatial audio technologies in our Source 2 game engine, so that a lot of our other games can use the technology, but Half-Life Alyx was the primary focus. As Dave said, I worked a lot with him and other sound designers on the team to iterate on how to add spatial audio to Half-Life Alyx. Thanks.
And yes, I am back. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Can I see some happy love? Or there we go. Yay, back. Okay. I did attempt to get improved internet last week, but it still hasn't gotten installed yet, so oh well. So with that, let's go ahead and turn to the first question, which is I'd love for us to roll back the clock a little bit to the very beginning of when Index was being developed. And I was hoping some of you could talk about the goals and requirements that you actually had for sound on the Index. How did you figure out what those goals were? And perhaps as interestingly, how did they change as development progressed, as sort of the rubber met the pavement and you kind of got a sense of what was going to be practical? So this, I think Emily is probably a good one to start with this question, but I'd love for all five of you to sort of answer it.
Yeah, I'll start with it. So it was, I mean, as I kind of mentioned in my brief introduction there, I think coming to Valve and working on headphones was like the last thing that I thought I would be doing, or working on hardware at all, just because that's not, you know, traditionally that hadn't been my area of expertise at all. But because roles are so nebulous at Valve, to be a part of the audio team just basically means you have the ability and option to help out with any problem that Valve has, or any goals that Valve has that includes audio. And so in 2011, when Valve sort of announced that it was moving into hardware, I think they initially announced that they were going to work on a Steam box, which is their own console, their own sort of gaming console platform. We also hired a bunch of really interesting and talented VR people. And so that's how VR sort of got its start at Valve. And when I started at Valve in 2013, there were a few folks working on in just basically research in VR. And they didn't have any audio people in their cabal or anyone really representing audio, and they weren't thinking about audio. So I just decided I saw a need to go down and help them out and at least champion audio as a thing that they need to think about. And so, yeah, so it started in 2014. The first thing that I started working on was sort of doing a bunch of binaural simulation evaluations. And at that particular point in time, VR was, as VR was sort of coming more into the spotlight, and people were paying, large companies like Oculus and Valve were paying attention to virtual reality. There was a lot of hubbub and a lot of hype around this new wave of 3D audio. And so there were a lot of third-party companies and groups hoping and working on sort of resurrecting this old research that until VR came along had really been buried in sort of third-party sound cards and PC hardware as like this sort of umbrella solution to helping customers experience like true 3D sound processing and HRTF binaural algorithms. And there's a long, complicated history, obviously, before that. But the thing that was interesting to our VR team internally was that the notion of like 3D sound wasn't a new one. And I think they were kind of thinking that with VR, there would be this completely new way of experiencing 3D sound compared to movies and TV. But if you're a gamer at all, you kind of understand, probably even just as a consumer of games, you probably understand that 3D sound has been around since 1994, going back to like Doom. And basically what I mean by 3D sound is when you move the camera in a game, which is essentially your head from a first-person perspective, that sound appears to remain static in space, or it moves with you, or it has a virtual position in the virtual space. So it responds to where your head is looking. Now, whether your head is controlled by a mouse and keyboard or whether it's controlled by a VR headset, it kind of doesn't really matter to us on the software side, how you input where you're looking around. So anyway, the VR team at Valve, part of my job was just kind of educating them on the history of 3D sound, where we're at, and sort of understanding for myself where we could innovate and what actually needed to change so that a sound experience for a VR customer was as immersive as the visuals were. Because that seems to me to be the biggest bang for buck in VR. It was just like you weren't looking at a screen, everything was life size. Immersion to me seems to be the biggest goal, and the people on the team that I was working with kind of agreed from a visual standpoint. So at that point, with all that sort of said, we conducted a bunch of binaural HRTF simulations, and we set up some small studies at Valve, and they were very, qualitative studies. We didn't really have an accurate way of measuring whether binaural HRTF algorithms were we didn't have a great resolution for measuring their effectiveness. So basically all we could do was ask people to identify, where they thought a sound was within a rough approximation. And that was sort of how we're evaluating these binaural algorithms. And the results from that were pretty underwhelming, to be honest, back in 2014. The people that we were testing with are just people in the office, not necessarily sound people. And the binaural algorithms were okay, but I think our studies showed that people were able to pinpoint sound location sort of accuracy better by about 10 to 15% with a binaural algorithm versus not even having one on the sound source to begin with. So, we knew some work had to be done there. And then also at the same time, I was questioning just in a broad sense about what makes sound immersive. And was there anything that I could remember in my past where I've just been completely immersed by sound? And that's when I came up with, I had this memory of a kid of laying between two speakers in my parents' living room, and inward facing speakers, I should say. So I take two stereo speakers, face them towards each other, and lay with my head in the middle of them and listen to old jazz records and stuff. And the difference in perspective from that was transformative for me. I think I did that when I was 11 or 12. I went through a phase where I just do that all the time. And I just didn't think there was a better way to listen to music. And I thought that was how the audio engineers at the time wanted me to listen to that music. I thought they wanted me to be on the stage with the musicians. And that was the only way I could really achieve that. It didn't really occur to me till later that audio was mixed from a point of view of being in an audience, some engineers try and simulate the feeling of standing in an audience at a concert. And so they'll create a stereo image that sort of reflects that feeling. And that totally didn't occur to me at the age of 11, that was their goal. So anyway, I had this memory and I was I didn't understand why that worked. I didn't understand why that felt really good. Obviously, I'd been evaluating binaural simulations, so I knew a little bit about, how the pinna, how the side of the head, the geometry of our chest and our shoulders and our head affects the sound and how immersed we feel in it. So then the next logical step from that was, what happens if we just place two tiny speakers either side of the head and basically simulate what I used to do, and I think a bunch of other people probably used to do when we were kids, which is lay between two stereo speakers. What happens to game sound? What happens to how does 3D sound like that? And so we created a bunch of prototypes, and immediately, even with the shitty speakers that I bought from Office Max that weekend, it immediately sounded different. It immediately sounded more immersive. I didn't have to stand in a room and pitch people on this huge big history I just gave you guys. I just was here, put these on and tell me what you think. And people could hear the difference straight away. And I think that's one of the things we look for at Valve, especially that I look for, is that really the decisions that we make are really based off end user experience first and foremost. So we won't invest a ton of time and effort into maybe science or research that let me rephrase that. We do invest a ton of money into science and research, but I won't invest a lot of my attention into things that don't have a meaningful end result for users. And that might not mean that it might not have a meaningful end result 10 years from now, 20 years from now. That's totally fine. But when we're shipping products as Valve, we kind of have to be concerned about, what's available for us to use right then and there, or at least within the next sort of 2 to 3 year time frame. And so for me, for audio, sort of having the underwhelming experience of binaural sort of simulations back then in 2013 and 2014, and sort of having this memory of laying between two speakers, it was for the technology that exists right now, this seems like it might be the most optimal approach. And certainly the playtest feedback was really strong, and so that's how we ultimately proceeded slowly and steadily with that design over the next few years. So anyway, that's sort of the rough history of how that design sort of came about. And while I was doing all that, I was also working on Counter-Strike, which is, if anyone is familiar with Counter-Strike as an IP, it's an incredibly popular esport, probably one of the oldest, most long-running, successful esports titles. And 3D sound in that game is incredibly important, because people will win or lose matches depending on how quickly and how accurately they can hear their enemy. And so that community is very sensitive to 3D sound. So me as an individual, as an audio person working within all these domains simultaneously at Valve, all of these sort of ideas are swirling around in my head. And just to be an efficient worker at Valve, I'm trying to solve as many problems trying to hit as many birds with one stone as I possibly can. So yeah, Scott, does that sort of wrap up your?
Yeah, I think that's a great initial response. I'd love to turn the question now to Joy, who kind of joined a little bit later. And how were the goals and requirements for audio and index sort of expressed to you? And could you talk, sort of briefly about how you built a validation plan, and if sort of the specs were changing on the fly out from under you or anything like that?
Yeah. Yeah, so like I mentioned earlier, I came to the product after the architecture was defined, and sort of the first plastics were built. And so, from my perspective, it was just going in and seeing what was there, what was not optimized, what shouldn't be there, what should be there, and then trying to, hit a performance standpoint. So my particular background, I've worked in 3D audio for a while now, and I have a lot of experience in terms of testing, and have a lot of ideas in terms of how you might tune a system. And so I definitely employed a lot of that on the system. As Emily mentioned, going into Valve, it's really is about the experience of the system. And so a lot of the communications regarding the system were just listening. What are people liking? What are people not liking? What are they noticing? And so, going into it, there wasn't a lot of sort of test equipment that you might have in like an anechoic chamber or such. So I brought a lot of sort of homemade tools to evaluate, evaluate the system, including sort of binaural microphones, and sort of, made my own sort of mannequins to do some initial product testing, and then was able to build out a laboratory that has, the head and torso simulators, and the like. And so, created the specifications as we went, but creating the specifications really means sort of writing down what it's doing from a performance standpoint, and then from a tuning standpoint, have a lot of experience just regarding what you need for faithful 3D audio reproduction. From a basic headphone standpoint, it's very different than a closed headphone that you might have on some of the older systems like a Vive, or maybe just a traditional headphone. So, a closed back headphone, performance is really great when you're talking about noise isolation, both for the person wearing the headphone, but then also if you're at a trade show, which a lot of the VR systems were at their sort of early days, you want to block out a lot of the noise that's happening around you. And so, the first thing to tackle was the fact that it's, an open back headphone, and so there will be, just less space just due to, the fact that it is open in the back. And additionally, it's a dipole design, so the back of the driver is open. And so some of the questions regarding isolation in terms of, is there noise pollution that's happening because the back of the driver is open and it's radiating? Are we getting the maximum amount of bass just physically to the ear? These types of, was sort of the first issue to address in terms of, is the system optimized to have the maximum, frequency response? And so, did an evaluation of that. It's well designed. At the same time, the folks who did the transducer development, Tectonic, they were also working on just sort of extending the basic response of the headphone itself. And so once that was sort of set, this headphone, because it's open and it naturally sort of rolls off, then we have psychoacoustic bass, and so the tuning and how we might want to employ that, and what the specific algorithm is doing, and how that might interfere or interact with what is happening with the spatial audio. So that was probably one of the larger sort of specification challenges to address, to make sure that we had an appropriate level of base. And then when we're adding in these more complex sort of signal processing that's associated with the hardware, that it's not interfering with what's happening sort of upstream from design intent. And something like that, there's no real specification. You come in and say, well, you know, if you have this particular roll-off, if you have these number of harmonics generated, that you will somehow create an experience that's, you know, going to be the right experience, because it's so specific to the hardware. So for that, you know, it was a lot of iteration, a lot of testing. And again, this is where the focus on, you know, the actual performance that somebody is experiencing as an end user becomes really important. So I find a lot when I work with folks, particularly who have a background in maybe systems design, or maybe they have an academic background, or, you know, they're just sort of starting out, is a sort of an over-reliance on, well, I read this in a paper, or I did this measurement and this was my result, therefore it is the experience. And I think, you know, having sort of the wealth of knowledge that you have with people that 100% focus on the experience all the time, is that they're able to just sort of stop and listen and give you honest feedback that's not influenced by what they're seeing on a page. And I think as we create some of these new experiences, you know, coming in with sort of a set idea of what a performance specification should be, because, you know, I've designed headphones, or, you know, have a very specific sort of headphone testing protocol that may have worked for other types of devices. I think sort of coming in and sort of saying, this is how I measure, this is how I know I get good measurements, and then just sort of looking at those measurements and deciding whether or not you believe them in the context of sort of VR and AR. So that was sort of, you know, from a specification side, you know, certainly a lot of measurements were happening with some really great test equipment once we got it fully decked out. But, you know, you can write down the specs sort of as you go in something like this, and then just sort of rely on sort of basic, you know, good sort of acoustic design. You know, and then some of the parameters, other types of issues that might come into play with a sort of a product like this is it's an integrated product. So there's a lot of visual systems. There's a lot of sort of signals that are flying back and forth on the electrical board that maybe you don't want to have happen in the audio signal path. So there's a lot of sort of interesting things that are happening that are just sort of basic you know, design aspects that you can really qualify in terms of, like, the noise floor shouldn't be too loud. You know, we should have good sort of signal integrity of that type of nature. And then, you know, these headphones are shaking back and forth. And, you know, when you have a headphone that has like an inertial motion sensor on it, you need to make sure that there's good isolation. So a lot of just, you know, making sure that a system that's designed to, you know, from a mechanical standpoint, that might be prioritizing things that are visual, because it's such a sort of complex new experience to create sort of 3D visuals, you need to make sure that, you know, all the rest of the system doesn't have a sort of downstream impact on what the actual customer is going to experience, so that at the end point. So I don't know, from a specification standpoint, you know, I could certainly write a specification now, but I think going into it, you need to sort of bring in, you know, what you think you know, test it, and evaluate it within the context of the overall experience. I don't know. I think maybe that's a good stopping point.
Great. No, Joy, I think that's great.
Yeah, and I'd just like to
ahead,
add
Emily.
just one
Yeah.
second, Scott. Before Joy joined us as a contractor, you know, we had no idea about any of that. Because as I said, you know, my background isn't necessarily in hardware, so even setting up like a proper testing routine and qualifying the frequency responses against something and having benchmarks to test against, you know, that was a whole lot of information that, you know, Joy educated us on, and frankly, we just didn't know that we didn't know it. And that's always like a scary place to be in when you're shipping a project with Valve. So anyway, thank you, Joy, for coming and doing that for us. You know, she was just absolutely fantastic, and the index wouldn't sound nearly as good if it probably actually wouldn't. The audio would just be like, we would have just shipped a pair of earbuds in the box probably if it wasn't for Joy. So
I don't know about that. It's actually an extremely interesting architecture, unlike sort of other architectures. You know, if you evaluate a lot of system designs, the architecture is very unique, and I think they arrived at that from just focusing on the experience. But I think this is probably one of the most exciting products I got to work on, so thank you.
yeah, I think generally across the board at Valve, like, you know, we definitely bite off more than we can chew, and chew like crazy. And, you know, I mean, it's cool because we just end up being pretty lean in terms of how many people actually work on a product. And so for the index, I think it was, for a long time, it was for a full year, it was just me and Joy, and then we had an audio tester sort of help us out in the final stretch as well. Brett Angelo, who isn't here today, but you know, compared to probably some other companies that have like a few hundred people helping out split across various departments, this was just like an incredibly lean team. And that's just the way we operate at Valve. It allows us to be nimble, but it's also, you know, we can put ourselves in some pretty hairy situations sometimes, but it all worked out.
That's great. I would love to sort of bring Anish into the conversation at this point. So Emily, you talked about doing some early qualitative spatial studies. Anish obviously coming from ImpulseSonic. I don't know if ImpulseSonic was one of the tool sets that you evaluated, but could you talk about sort of the transition from ImpulseSonic to becoming you know, Valve's spatial audio solution, and what sorts of changes, updates, differences in focus, or if everything works swimmingly? I'd love to get more of a sense of how that transition occurred.
Yeah, let me just say, Anish, let me just say real quick that ImpulseSonic was, just to introduce you real quick, that ImpulseSonic was one of the binaural algorithms that we evaluated, and they were the best. They were in our studies that we did internally, they were the best sounding ones, because they took a holistic approach to simulating not only just the HRTF binaural algorithms, but also sound flow, sound propagation, reverb, and early reflections, late reflection modeling within the geometry of a game environment. And so when you combine all those two things together, combined with their awesome customer service and product focus, that kind of made the acquisition of ImpulseSonic a no-brainer for us. But I'll let Anish chime in there.
Thanks, Emily. In terms of transitioning from ImpulseSonic to Valve, it's incredible how much continuity there was in terms of developing the product. Like, Valve just sort of felt like a startup where everybody's sort of doing what's necessary, but a very, very well-funded startup in some sense. So when we joined with the goal of integrating spatial audio to CSGO. And this is something Emily mentioned a little while ago. There's so much focus on like shipping products and user experience that I think in a month of us joining the team, we shipped the spatial audio solution in CSGO. And a lot of listening, a lot of play testing, a lot of iterating on how the overall experience is when you add spatial audio to CSGO. And then obviously when we release, there's ton of feedback from the community, which was amazing. So then again, a whole bunch of iterating on how to improve that spatial audio. One of the key challenges in the context of CSGO was people are so familiar with the sounds that any change to the sound, because you're adding spatial sort of filtering on it, and if it changes the sound a lot, or even a tiny bit, that may not necessarily be acceptable, because people found all these sounds to be so familiar that any change may seem too different. So we had to do a lot of work on trying to make sure we keep the sounds as close to their original quality, but still sort of add spatial information in the DSP pipeline. So from there on, it was kind of there was a lot of knowledge within the team about spatial audio by the time we were there. When we started working with the audio team, David Faiz, and even the game developers on Half-Life Alyx, everybody seemed to have a good sense of the importance of spatial audio. So we started there, and then there's this another part that Emily mentioned. There's 3D audio where you're sort of getting a sense of where the sound is coming from. But there are other components where VR is just a perfect fit. And with Half-Life Alyx on an immersive experience, things like, can we do reverb of a space which matches the reverb, which matches the space itself very, very well? Or can you say that, hey, sound is bending around the corner? So we did a whole bunch of play testing on just Half-Life Alyx to see what are the right set of algorithms to use for Half-Life Alyx. We don't need everything real time, for example. So in Half-Life Alyx, after doing a whole bunch of play testing and sort of narrowing the scope to make sure you have as optimal a performance, but at the same time as immersive an experience. So we nailed down on a set of features early on in the project when I and my colleague Lakulesh sort of jumped on the project around 2018. But I can talk more about the details later. But one of the sort of the theme that have come across on every single project I have worked on within Valve is how sort of everybody is focused on user experience, and the amount of play testing that happens on every single project is just quite enormous, just to always keep sort of the end user experience in mind. So.
Great. I mean, that kind of leads me to sort of my next question. We've been talking about user experience. We've been talking about sort of a sense of immersion. I guess this is a question that I'm actually going to steer towards Robin as sort of the not audio focused person on the panel. How much advocacy and socializing and education and sort of awareness, how much did you see from the audio team, Robin? Like, how much was there, sort of opportunities to sort of educate and share and say audio can support the user experience? Like, talk about some prototypes or mock-ups that you got to experience, or when audio was a solve for a design problem that you were facing. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Alyx is sort of a strange project because it starts pretty small and was small for quite a while, and we were so busy that there was this organic growth, and this is not super unusual at Valve, but it was a little more organic than usual, in that people would just join the project and start to work. They would identify some hole in the product, something that it needed that still wasn't represented in some way by the resources that the team had at the time, and they'd just join a board. And that was one of the reasons, to go back to when we first started Alyx, our goal was to build a VR app, some kind of killer app or something for the Index. And we didn't start with the idea that it was going to be Half-Life. We just started with the idea that we need to build some kind of, something from using our IPs that fit VR really well. And we started by prototyping various things, and pretty quickly went after Half-Life. And one of the reasons we went for it is we were looking for something that sort of answered as many questions as possible as quickly as possible. And one of the things that was really good about picking Half-Life as the IP to build was that everyone in the company understood it really well. And so it took very little to explain to people what it was we were trying to do, which is really useful when you're trying to convince people to come and work on the project, help you out. And so where if we were building something from scratch, there'd be lots of questions from people in the company about what it is they would do if they came over and joined the project. Instead, people could look at where we're at, look at what we built, and just immediately understand how they could contribute. And so as a result, there were some weeks where I'd turn around and find that, there are like 3 folks over there that are working, and they just shown up, brought their desks in and started building stuff. And so in those early days, there was such a sort of, focus on moving as quickly as we could to sort of solve the gameplay problems associated with VR and stuff like that, I know I wasn't super focused on audio personally at all. And I think we ended up being more guinea pigs for some of the stuff that Emily was doing. I remember she showed up, and after the initial showing us some of the, letting us put on the first prototypes of the off-ear headsets, she gave us off-ear headsets to take home and just use at home, which I'm still using on my computer today, because I just love the off-ear headset approach. And so I think for a bunch of us, we were guinea pigs of the sort of stuff that audio was trying to do. And then there were a few the specific things that stick out in my mind. There were a few places where the team was grappling with choices it could make, and audio was sort of, I think, some of the ways we solved those problems. So one problem that I remember the team grappled with was, can we have the main character talk? Like if you're a protagonist that you are ostensibly, being in the game talks, how do you know that it was your character talking and not some other character in the environment? And that was something that there was a bunch of debate about in those early days. And audio, that was one of I think the first place I remember where we really asked the audio team, like, hey, what are the ways we can solve this? And some of those early conversations about, like, what sort of processing can we do on voice? Can we make it sound like you're thinking? Can it make it sound like, like, are there going to be points where we want the player to act like they're sort of talking to themselves, or when they're projecting and talking to others? And what kind of processing opportunities are there around that sort of stuff? So I remember sort of moments like that, but I don't know. Perhaps it might be interesting to ask Emily or Dave if there are the places where they felt like they had to do the most sort of work to convince the team of any particular audio things. I mean, one of the sort of side effects of the way we work at Valve generally is that that you're surrounded by people who are really good at what they do, right? So as a general rule, you don't have to, the design of the company is intended such that you don't have to spend much time looking at other people, worried about this, whatever it is they're doing. You can sort of relax and trust that they're making the right choices about what it is they're spending their days on, and that it'll all turn out fine in the end. And that, Alyx, like pretty much I think every other product we've built, turned out that way. We had a mix of newer people and experienced people at Valve on it, and it was interesting to watch the newer people sort of worrying as we got closer and closer to the shipping date. Like, there's stuff over there that's not finished. What about that? Hey, how is that going to be good enough? And just knowing that as someone who's been at Valve through that process many times, that it's like it's all going to work out fine. The people on that are really, really good at what they do, and sure enough, it all worked out fine.
That's great. That leads actually into my next question, which I want to start with Dave, which is, can you guys talk, and this may be a question for each of you, can you talk about some of the unique aspects of designing and creating sound for Alyx, for the Index versus other platforms? I know many of you were involved in Counter-Strike before them, but what was different? What were some of the rules that you had to discard or change or throw away?
Yeah, so for Half-Life Alyx and VR titles in general, I think there's just sort of a depth of content that I don't know if it's required, but I think it lends itself to it. In VR, you can feel a lot closer to things than you can in a flat screen game, and so developing sounds that played into that and allow players to sort of get their faces up to things and get kind of a little sonic reward was a thing that we talked about a lot. I think that for Alyx specifically, a lot of the issues, not issues, a lot of the concerns were, how do we make a game? Opportunities. That's a good one. Were things like, how do we make a game that sounds like Half-Life, but is also new and fresh and focused on VR, and doesn't fall back too much on the nostalgia of the older Half-Life sounds. Sorry, one second. And I think that as far as the index definitely solved more problems than it created for us. We spent a lot of time in the early days of Alyx and previously on the lab worrying about positional audio, binaural kinds of things, and also bass response. We looked at a lot of, like, could we have a subwoofer in the room with the player? Could we ship a like, there was like a vibrating vest that you wore that kind of was tuned like a subwoofer to give you the effect of bass. Because a lot of the earlier headphones that we were using just didn't have very satisfying bass, and so the psychoacoustic bass of the Index really solved a lot of those problems, and the combination of the off-ear headphone design and the Steam Audio HRTF processing really solved a lot of the where's that sound coming from. The binaural positioning is kind of mushy that we had a lot in the early days. And
yeah,
so I
in
think,
fact, I remember asking you. I remember I was like pretty. I mean, I thought I knew bass was going to be an issue, and that was kind of like once we got the feedback from the prototype that the general effect was pretty cool. Then, like, for the next 2 years, I was just like, how do we get more bass? How do we get more bass? And I remember saying to Dave and the rest of the audio team working on Half-Life Alyx, I was like, hey, just so you know, this might be our frequency response curve. As you can see, it doesn't really have much data below 100 hertz. Just wondering if you could take that into consideration with your sound design. And like literally Dave and Mike and like the rest of the audio team it was just like crickets. It was like, no, wait. And I was like, well, okay, we'll have to just keep focusing on this as like a major problem. But it never really occurred to us to, like, we just always wanted good bass. For me, it would actually have been a design killer to ship a pair of headphones that didn't have adequate bass for Half-Life Alyx. Like, I actually would have preferred everyone just use regular headphones, because it's just such an important part of immersion to try and play like a VR experience that's as visually immersive as Half-Life Alyx, and then play all the audio through something that sounded like, you know, a cell phone speaker. To me, it was like, we would have actually started to go in a different direction if Joy and Tectonic hadn't really come to the table with like pushing as much bass out of those little speakers as possible. So it was, you know, that was one of our primary concerns with that design, and that was definitely something that I was you know, focused on along with the rest of the Half-Life audio team, just making sure we had plenty of bass, and I didn't want Dave to have to like make compromises with his sound design for that experience. So it was scary for a little bit, but we got there.
And I think the good bass response helped overall headset adoption, at least on the audio team, for testing as well. Because one of the things about Valve is if people don't like your thing, they just won't use it. Like, they might tell you about it, but if people don't like it, it'll just get shoved in a corner and not used. And so the fact that it sounded good and looked good and was very usable, I think helped a lot to get us onto it earlier for more testing.
Yep.
Thank you all very much. So it's been about 45 minutes. I'd love to open us up to questions from the audience at this point. I would ask you guys questions all day, but I know that lots of people who've attended probably have their own specific targeted questions. So as you probably are seeing, the raise hand icon has just popped up magically for everyone. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and one of our moderators will call on you and unmute you, and all the audio will magically work, and we'll all hear it and respond to it, and it's going to be amazing.
All right, so the first question asker is Avril. Go ahead, Avril, with your question.
Hello?
Hey, Avril, we can hear you. Awesome.
Nice. Hi. So Hi, my name is Avril Martinez. I worked on the HoloLens team at Microsoft for a little while. I did some of their UE sounds. And I think it's really particularly interesting that you were talking about speaker pattern and how that influenced sound design, because that was something that came up for us as a big issue, at least in the first iteration, and it got a little bit better on the second iteration. But mainly my question was, how did you guys handle sound design iteration when it came to changing speakers and the pattern switching and stuff like that, back when you guys were kind of in your nightmare zone?
I can start with
Yeah,
that.
yeah, cool.
So for me personally, I'm of the belief that good sounds will sound good, sort of across multiple platforms.
Mm-hmm.
And so we as an audio team always try to make it so that the our customers who have put effort into having the nicest audio system will have a really nice sounding game, and people who have like an off the shelf audio system, by virtue of the fact that we've made this really good sounding game, will also have a good sounding game. And so going from earlier headphone models, which were uh, sort of, we had a period where we were using the Vive, and they didn't have this was before the audio strap, and so everybody just had their own headphones, and then going to like the Vive with the audio strap, and then to Index, and I think with probably some other steps in there for other individuals in a good direction. Recall any specific instances where we heard things on the Index that had been done earlier and gone, oh, that really doesn't sound as good as we thought it did. I think mostly things sounded better than they had previously.
I guess I'd like to ask a quick follow-up question for all of you, sort of related to that, which would be, how much was research and experimentation being pursued as the project progressed? In other words, was there a point where you were supposed to go pencils down and just assume that the hardware was locked? And then how many times after that did they actually pick the pencils back up and say, nope, we're actually going to keep changing the frequency response or the EQ curve or the other aspects that impacted how you authored content?
Yes.
Yeah, I just had a rumor set as well.
I can hear.
But lots of hearts, good.
Actually, we can't hear you in the second room, so I think you need to go on air.
It's in the present host tools. There's an on air button.
Yeah, every time we have a soft reset, you need to re-click that again.
And amplify my voice too.
Yes.
On it. Okay. Okay. There we go. How about that? Is that better?
That does the trick. Thank you, Emily.
Great.
Yay.
So as I was just saying, the kind of tradition at Valve is, I mean, we do a lot of rolling updates to all of our products. So products, basically, if you can update something after it launches, we do operate like that. So I think I remember having a discussion with Joy at some point, especially regarding the frequency response curve of the Index. Was is this something that we could, if we didn't like it or we got a bunch of bad feedback from customers after it shipped, is this something we can change after we ship it? And I think that was absolutely possible in that regard. So I think for a lot of our, when we're shipping something, we're like, what's our first best guess, basically, or not a guess, but what's the foot that we want to put forward first, and then knowing that we can sort of roll updates through Steam afterwards, is really cool and awesome. But as far as like a pencils down sort of thing, that usually happens, in my experience at least, that usually happens really late, and maybe Dave can talk about that with in the context of Half-Life Alyx as well, but certainly from a hardware perspective, yeah, we were, anything that we can change after the hardware actually ships, we will. I think the thing with hardware that Joy really helped us out with was eliminating rub and buzz on a lot of the moving parts. You know, that's just something that you can't, as a hardware product, compared to software, you just can't ship with that stuff. So you have to kind of nail it before it goes into mass production. Yeah, so Dave or Joy, feel free to augment that.
As far as pencils down for audio, I mean, I think we may have shipped content after the game launched. I could be wrong though. Certainly very close to after the game launched. I don't remember the index after a certain point where it was pretty solidified. I don't remember the index being that much of a moving target as far as its capabilities. I think it got to a pretty good spot, and then most of the changes were tweaks and bug fixes rather than, oh, we're gonna totally change the way that this does this thing.
Yeah. And I think it helped, and maybe Robert, like it helps that the index kind of shipped a year before Half-Life Alyx came out, so we had time to change the index, and if we needed to totally change the frequency response curve, yeah, that was not intentional. But I remember Robin towards the end of Half-Life Alyx, Dave just basically saying like every week was pens down week, and the audio team being like, nah.
That's adorable. Least disrespectful of any kind of scheduling. Completely. I mean, I could talk a little bit more broadly, not just about audio, but like every project at Valve is sort of responsible for running a schedule and thinking about what it's trying to do and when it's trying to ship and so on. And you know, one of the freedoms we have is we're not beholden to anyone outside the organization. And so we have the real freedom, you know, to decide when we ship and what we ship and how we ship and all those things. And that's, you know, it's a blessing and a curse. It's really good to have that freedom, but it sometimes means you know, you're responsible thinking about the set of trade-offs that you need to make. And so, you know, the one that Emily talked about there was absolutely a trade-off. We spent a lot of time thinking about, you know, when we started the project, we fully intended to ship the, you know, whatever it was we built, we wanted to ship it with the index. And as the index got closer to shipping and Alyx got closer, you know, we were constantly asking ourselves, like, can we make the same date as the index? And the index is, you know, wasn't, I think, if I remember rightly, they were sort of telling us back in the first couple of years, we don't know when we're going to ship, but we'll know that we'll have to lock it in about 9 months before we ship, if I remember. So we were sort of on Alyx constantly asking ourselves, you know, can we ship 9 months from now? And as it got closer to the point where index, you know, we knew when index was going to ship and we were looking at Alyx, we were starting to ask ourselves the questions of what's more valuable here. You know, we can obviously help index's sales by shipping, you know, the product with index. It's a much more compelling and interesting, you know, package for customers. But at the same time, we were really cognizant that Alyx was probably going to be around for a while, that for at least some period of time, it was probably going to be the, you know, if you're trying to convince a friend to try out VR or to pick up some VR hardware, that you're probably going to suggest that they try out Alyx. It'll be one of the sort of things that, or we hoped it would be one of the things that people said, like, this is why VR is interesting as a medium. You really got to check it out. And so, you know, we were thinking about if we ship a little later, obviously it's better, and that helps sort of VR in a broad sense, much, we felt, more than if we, you know, shipped it earlier. And then there are all sorts of other, you know, there are people involved, and people have goals and pride and want to be able to finish things and that they set in motion, all that sort of stuff. So so in the end, we did decide to delay and ship it afterwards. It ended up being almost about a year late, right? I think, which is a bummer, but that's just, you know, the way it went. And so with respect to your question, it wasn't really you know, there wasn't really a point where we said, you know, we're going to do R&D up until this state or anything. Like, you know, we often have some sort of nebulous, semi-nebulous pre-production process on a project at Valve, but Alyx was a weird one where we sort of forced ourselves to jump right past that. We were, you know, and some of this is just getting into, you know, the history of the previous projects we'd worked on and so on. We really wanted to, you know, we'd had a couple of version, you know, Half-Life projects that didn't end up shipping. We weren't happy with them for various reasons and so on. And so one of the first questions many people had in the company when looking at Alyx about, you know, and thinking about whether or not they wanted to go work on it was, you know, is this one going to ship? Why should I believe that this Half-Life game will ship when the past couple haven't? And so we were very cognizant of that in how we structured ourselves and the process we took to building Alyx. And one of the various things we decided early on was let's really focus on building stuff that was going to ship right from the get-go. So some of the, you know, first levels we built for prototyping and building and playtesting were parts of the game that eventually ended up shipping. We built it was very lean in terms of its content production. We you know, when we compare it to sort of our other projects, the amount that we built and didn't ship is very small relative to other projects, and that was all, you know, designed at trying to convince ourselves and everyone on the project, everyone thinking about working on the project, that you know, that their time was going to be worth spent there. So, you know, as Emily sort of said, there was really a constant, you know, in the last year or so, there were lots of pencils down moments where it was just like, all right, let's build this and finish it and call it done, and then build the next bit and call it done, and just sort of forcing ourselves to keep moving forward.
All right, Lawrence, go ahead with your question.
Cool. I had a question. Emily, you said you championed audio at Valve as VR development was ramping up. And I've had to do the same thing for during 20 years at every game developer I worked for as an audio director.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Yeah.
just thought maybe you could talk about that. And why is it that audio always seems to require a champion?
That's a really good question. You know, I think it used to annoy me that I would have to do that role, which I think from, you know, kind of the tone of your question, it can certainly be taken that way. Like, why? I think as sound people, we are obviously forced to respond to visuals, and so we have the visuals in our mind a lot. And then when we see people working in visual domains, and, you know, their audio is the last thing on their mind,
Or it's turned
just
off,
like,
right? It's just turned off.
or it's turned off. It's like, what the heck, you guys? Like, come on. And that, you know, that annoyed me for yeah, there was an underlying mood that I had at Valve and other game companies that I've worked at. But then something changed when I was working on the VR team early on. And that was, I think, me personally, no one else really changed anything. I just changed the way I looked at it. But the way I came to look at it, and this worked really well for me, was the people that I was working with in the visual domains in VR, you know, just huge nerds. They just like loved what they were doing. They're super into it. You know, they would be working till 10 o'clock at night. Just, you know, I'd go down to like the 13th floor at Valve, and there'd be ultimately like 3 or 4 engineers just huddled over a dim light, soldering circuit boards together and stuff. And, you know, I think I kind of realized that what they want, what they need is someone that loves audio as much as they love what they're doing. And to expect them to have that same love of audio as what I do just felt sort of a little bit unreasonable, or a little bit sort of, you know, misguided in a way. And
Right.
so instead of kind of being mad or, you know, a little bit upset that they weren't into audio as much as I was, instead I sort of took it as an opportunity to show to them that I love audio as much as they love visuals. And at that point, when I shifted my perspective, that sort of changed the tone of my communications with a lot of my team members, and then that just had really good results. Like, people were super excited to work with me, and see what I had to propose, and like just listen to what I had to say about stuff. Whereas me sort of preemptively coming in with this, like, why haven't you guys already thought about this sort of attitude, immediately put them in a defensive sort of situation. It just made communication harder. So once I sort of embraced my role of being the audio champion and took that pressure off my colleagues to play that role, it was like everything just got so much easier from that point onwards. And I had the full support, and I felt really supported and loved by my colleagues on the VR team, at that point. And that's kind of worked really well for me. So I don't expect my colleagues to love audio as much as what I do. And instead, like, I feel it's my job to do that for them. And, they seem to really appreciate that. So that's how I kind of resolved that underlying tension that has been, prevalent through a lot of the studios that I've worked at. And it just came from me just shifting the way I look at it.
I love that. Thank you.
I have a theory, Emily, if you want to hear it.
I'm not sure, but all right.
Something to do with respect to schedules might be.
Oh, well, yeah. Okay, yeah, whatever. Sorry, did you say something?
Actually, I have one random observation, which, in that when there's such a focus on getting to the point where you can playtest, you can playtest without sound, but you can't playtest without visual. Like, I'm not saying it's good or anything like that. I'm just saying I think you can't not render something. So ultimately, I think that in some ways, at least at Valve, it's just people trying to get to the point where they can see what they're trying to build on screen and so on, not at the point where it's any good, and so they can sort of forget about the bits they haven't got to, right? Like, it's the same as like when physics isn't working or something. If it's not affecting the playtest, people don't notice and all that sort of stuff, and then and
actually, I think one of the best things I did as a sound person to help relate to other departments was to actually develop and build my own project outside of Valve holistically. I just, learned to program and built my own iPhone game. And so I took on the role of programmer, artist, effects person, like everyone. And then when you do that, I just realized like what role audio truly actually plays in the large scheme of a development cycle of a software product, at least. And, that helped put my role in perspective purely as an audio person. And, what Robin says is the truth. It's just the truth of the matter. And then it's actually interesting because I think that actually helped me enjoy my role as an audio person, because the amount of pressure that designers and artists have on them, like, I personally wouldn't do it. I'm not sure. Like, being an audio person is pretty good because no one really outside of audio really knows what you do, so that's cool. And also you have a lot of, by the time audio work, you're sort of, as an audio person, whether you realize it or not, and maybe this is only true for me, but you're pawning off responsibility, like huge product level like questions about directions to go in for the whole entire product off onto other departments. So you're saying, what does the game look like? Like, that's not your problem. Like, what does the game play like? That's really not your problem. I mean, you can help fix problems and stuff, but you haven't got that weight on your shoulders. So once I realized that as a sound designer, I was like, well, I feel like I'm in a pretty privileged situation in this role, actually. And so even that perspective just helped me be like, well, how can I take some of that weight off my colleagues? Like, how can I help them, make some of these decisions, make their lives a little bit easier, through audio or any way I can. So, yeah, it's just like a different perspective that I had when I first started in the games industry, and I really wanted everyone to love audio as much as I did, and when they didn't, they were wrong.
I do like the way that I having not actually worked anywhere else, I hear that some companies, they tend to, those audio folks are siloed off, or they're more sort of separate in the service department, or they break up by disciplines in some fashion or something. But the way that the audio folks at Valve are embedded in the team really helps for a bunch of the things, the obvious thing would be, I don't know if people have played Alyx, but there's a point later in the game where you run into an enemy that is blind and can only hear, and it's very dangerous. You can't hurt it. You just need to avoid it and deal with it. And you can make noises by breaking glass bottles and stuff to move it around. And that was a character where audio was just a huge part of both its gameplay, its personality, just everything about it. And so, the Roland, who did a lot of that, I think I might be.
Yeah, no, that's right.
Yeah, Roland did a lot of the work on that, and I would see that team. I think it was one of the first monsters we designed for VR, and then it was sort of one of the last areas of the game to finally finish sort of and ship. So I think there might have been 2.5 years of playtesting at a guess on just that 45-minute section of the game, and the number of times I'd wander past the playtest room and see the set of 8 or 9 people, including Roland, watching a playtester and then debating for hours afterwards about how to improve what they'd built. I think was critical. That entire section of the game would not have succeeded at all if the audio person wasn't just as much responsible for the gameplay sort of construction, but also playtesting and evaluation of that enemy. I've always thought that was one of the coolest things, and with the audio folks here at Valve, and it's I got to experience that with Emily on the Combine Soldiers, where we collaborated a bunch on their entire audio stuff. And there were gameplay problems I had as a designer and programmer on that she solved through the use of the voice work she did in those soldiers. So having audio folks who really understand the product and evaluating it, from the user experience. They're not just listening to the sounds as they play, but they're watching the play tests. They're in there themselves, and they're talking about how some problem in the audio might need to be solved with AI choices I'm making, or vice versa. And, that sort of stuff. It feels very fruitful, but also critical to really audio being that sort of first-class citizen in the game.
I'd like to add that on this project, I think the non-audio people on the team, maybe the best I've worked with at getting audio involved early and often in the process, and they all deserve credit for that, because they did a really good job, level designers especially.
All right, so the next question is from Len. Len, go ahead and ask your question. Are you there, Len? All right, moving on. Andrew.
Hi,
Go ahead, Andrew.
this is a question thank you, for the hardware and sound design integration. How much of an effort was there to document the DSP stack on the hardware for the sound team? Or was it more of a sort of experiential thing where you relied, again, on their expertise as experienced designers to evaluate it in real time and make adjustments?
I mean, if you're talking about the hardware DSP, I think, the interface between what's happening in the game engine and the rendering, I think it was, from my perspective, somewhat kept separate. So I was trying to optimize the hardware Obviously, there's various types of DSP that are living on the hardware or related to the hardware. But the goal there is to make it really neutral and to make sure that it doesn't interfere with the type of processing that they're doing upstream. So that's from a documentation standpoint, none of the specifications or the particular firmware settings would have been passed upstream. It would have been more of a tell us if this is working for you. If it's not working for you, then you need to let us know. But it's a lot of that is related to the actual physical hardware. So if it's going to distort, or if it's going to have some type of issue because the driver's moving too much, or there's mechanical distortions, or the gain tables need to be set such that the noise is kept low. I mean, a lot of those aren't the type of things that you would want someone who's not actively working with the hardware to address, because you can mess up the hardware, in which case that sort of defeats the purpose of having a really neutral device. So at least from the hardware perspective, I don't know if Anish or someone else has another perspective from the game engine side.
I think we did once we got some prototypes for Index, we did a bunch of listening, and I think we also looked at frequency response that we got from the hardware team to see basically if we have to make any adjustments to the spatial audio algorithms specifically to sort of enable the features that Index off-ear headphones are providing. But a bunch of listening, we got to a point where there was nothing special we had to do to sort of to change the spatialization algorithm in a way that improves spatialization, or has to be tuned to make sure there are no differences. We didn't see basically any major differences, but most of that listening came from sort of listening, and there weren't any sort of rigorous listening experiments we ended up conducting or anything like that. There weren't any red flags to begin with, so it didn't sort of warranted us to spend a bunch of time just to figure out if we have to have another DSP stack on the software side to sort of either augment or compensate in any way the floating headphone design.
Just to add
Okay,
on
thank
to
you very
Andy's
much.
question a little bit. Oh, sorry. I was going to add on to
No, you're
Andy's
good.
question a little bit for him. I mean, audio perception is kind of it can be a squishy thing. So I would love to expand on this question just a little bit, and if you guys could talk about how much golden ears testing you depended on versus sort of repeatable, automatable, validatable results. So you talked a little bit about frequency response analysis. Were there other things that you did where you were able to check from hardware revision to hardware revision, or from software build to software build, and say, oh, our spatial algorithm has degraded in some sort of automated way, or was it generally the core sound designers putting on headphones, trying a new build, and saying something seems broken? How much was it one versus the other?
I mean, if it's a spatial audio question, I don't, Anish, if you want to take that. I mean, obviously we do a huge amount of testing on the other side, but if you want to go first.
On the spatial audio software side, generally we have found it to be very hard to have sort of automated just listening test of some way to evaluate the quality of what your final spatial audio algorithm is. It's generally hard. We have made, for example, changes to our HRTF processing, but all of that has heavily relied on tons and tons of listening to make sure that any changes we have made still sound good. And this was no different even with any hardware we received from Index, where there was constantly a lot of listening with the hardware and also in the game to make sure any integrations that have happened into the game that there's nothing off. So we relied heavily on basically a lot of listening in the game. There were issues that come up, but they were mostly from, hey, we listened to sort of various different aspects of the audio, spatial audio in this case, in the game with the particular hardware to find issues, as opposed to sort of having some fully automated test, which we have found to be we are unclear if there is one sort of efficient way of doing it.
Maybe I could just add, so on the hardware side, making sure that every piece of hardware has the same performance is very critical. So if you If you've ever measured, this is a weird question, but or a statement, if you've ever measured a lot of headphones, like really a lot of headphones, across a lot of different people, the traditional type headphone, it varies quite a lot. You might have plus minus 10 dB in the bass, you might have quite a lot of different spectral effects at the higher frequency due to sort of placement and also the size of the driver, and if it's in breakup mode. And so, from an experience standpoint, if you're trying to define what the variability is, from test to test, you really need to understand everything that's happening. So if we're doing modifications of spatial audio, if they're changing the game engine, there's a lot of things that can change there in terms of what they're designing, but because it's also dynamic and interactive game experience, what somebody is experiencing each time, when they're playing Half-Life Alyx, for example, they're going to experience something different and sort of be in a different sort of state in that type of game. And then from the hardware side, this particular design, I think one of the great things about it is how tight the tolerances are. And so from a shipping standpoint, we tested every device. There's a lot of engineering type tests you do, a lot of creation of the tests to qualify the performance and variability. But once it actually hits the production line, there's extremely tight tolerances in terms of what's actually shipping. And the actual design of the headphone is making it so that you're actually getting the experience that was intended. Whereas with a lot of headphones, you're really not, unless you're really calibrating or something where you're actually taking the headphone and measuring it on yourself. You're going to have, a huge amount of variability that might even take you away from what the design intent was of the game designer or the sound engine.
That's interesting. It's almost like integrated speaker design on some other platform, like a portable platform or something where you can, or a mobile platform where you can kind of depend on the endpoint a lot more.
Yeah, I mean, so, well, actually, there's a huge amount of variability just, from transducers or whatnot, but, and then also, you have with headphones, it's very close to the ear, so there's so much placement sensitivity because the relative motion is so high. But, with like a speaker type system, that's something where everyone kind of walks into it and experiences it as they naturally would. But with headphones, as something that you're wearing, that sort of device to user interaction variability is exceptionally high. And so as we evaluate any of this type of, any type of spatial audio evaluation you're going to do, you really need to understand absolutely everything. It needs to be transparent all the way through the entire system so that you understand all the way through what's really actually happening and, what the sources of error are, because they may not actually be the algorithm. They may actually be maybe something that's more human device related.
Right, and
Great question. Thank you again.
Next question is Aaron McLaren. Hold on just a second. All right, for some reason, Aaron, I cannot actually put you on air right now. Hold on just 1 second.
Aaron, we can actually hear you.
Yeah,
But we can make sure we repeat it if everybody else can't hear.
Great.
Okay, was everyone in the audience able to hear that, or should I repeat them real quick? Give me love if you could hear it.
You better repeat, Scott. We couldn't hear it.
I will repeat. That is totally fine. So the first question was, were there any experiments with hybrid design, so headphones plus subwoofer or plus external speakers? And the second one was if you could talk about developing a unique bespoke audio engine. Your title did not use audio middleware, which is a set of tools that many games use, things like Audio Kinetics Wise or Firelight's FMod. So could you talk about that? So let's start first with experimentation with hybrid, which we touched on a little bit with haptic vests and subwoofers, but I'd love to get a little more detail from you guys on that.
Yeah, I can take that one. Yeah, the answer is yes, we did a lot. We evaluated a lot of different possible hardware solutions aside from just the off-ear design. And I would actually just have to say that personally, I think my favorite way of listening to VR audio today is the off-ear headphone design coupled with a subwoofer in VR. Obviously, sub frequencies are, their position can be somewhat more nebulous, so it's not as important as being hyper-directional, so they don't really need to be too accurate in that domain. And that's a really fun thing. If you have a chance to do that, I think we make that possible through the Steam VR settings. You can mirror audio to a second device, and if you have that second device being a subwoofer plugged into your computer, and you jump into Half-Life Alyx, I'm pretty sure that is the best, most fun audio experience you could probably have today. We tried haptic vests, haptic chairs. We tried near field surround sound systems. So basically the same thing as the off-ear speaker, but in like a surround sound configuration. So there's actually 5 speakers dangling around the head. Kind of like one of those Akubra hats, Robin, in Australia with the corks around it. I don't think you ever saw that one. But that was really interesting. We learned a lot from doing that. And then, of course, we got the luxury of trying a 22.1 surround sound, like Atmos system in VR. And that was interesting, too. The main drawback of that one being, like, it was really hard to simulate near-field sounds when all your speakers are, at a distance around, like, placed meters away from you. But it did sound beautiful for far-field sound emulation. And so, yeah, we tried various combinations of these things. And then ultimately, the deciding factor was, what are our users, what's going to be easy and most likely for them to use? Because as Dave said earlier, if it's too difficult, then people just aren't going to use it, no matter how good it sounds. And so, yeah. Yeah, and that processing actually happens all in engine.
Could you repeat the question, Emily? We can't hear
Oh,
that
sorry.
in a second.
Yeah, the question was, have we tried a sort of a hybrid solution where we do close sounds that are virtual sounds that are in close proximity have HRTF, and then as they get further away, they blend to a more surround sound or even stereo field. And the answer is yes, we do that all the time. But that processing happens inside the game engine itself. And that's one of the cool things about, working with Anish and Lakulish, and I'm sure Dave can speak to this more, but for us, it's not just a question of do we apply an HRTF algorithm to a virtual sound source. It's, and we have, thousands of virtual sound sources existing within a scene at any particular one point in time. It's when we talk about virtual sound source, we're not talking about the end speaker array that the player is listening to. We're talking about each individual sound point in the virtual world. And so as sound designers, we had a really nice level of control over how much HRTF was applied and where it was applied and how it was applied, which as a sound designer working in a virtual environment, I think that's really important. If your choice is just, do I add an HRTF filter to this sound or not, then, well, A, that's just kind of inaccurate. That's going to result in an inaccurate simulation of sound in that space, and B, it's probably not going to sound that great in all circumstances. But maybe Dave has something you want to talk about, like how you blended, how you created like hybrid sound solutions. Yeah.
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
So the second part of the question was building a unique bespoke audio engine. What were some of the capabilities and features that you were really able to exploit, or that were specific to building an engine for VR?
Yeah. So one of the cool things about Valve is having people who create the audio engine and the audio processing just right down the hall, like Anish or Jay Stelly or Mike Moraski. So if we need a thing, it's easy to get them to do it, or to hop into the code and do it yourself if you're like me and it's not too complicated. So we have, as far as the capabilities of the audio engine, there's not one thing that we do across everything. Not every sound, but many sounds are unique in their use case, and we're able to define sort of custom behaviors for them. HRTF is part of that. Distance attenuation and blending that you talked about is part of that. So for some sounds, distance, we process distance using like a far sound and a near sound, and crossfade between the two of them. For some, the far sound is just the dry sound being sent to our DSP. So there's not sort of a one size fits all solution for anything really. It's more, what does a sound need, and can we come up with a way to do that? And having our sort of homebrewed audio system enables us to do that relatively quickly, and to expand the system as necessary if parts are missing.
And to add to what Dave said, so the audio engine in Source 2 is pretty powerful. And one of the sort of key feature is it's tightly integrated with game engine in some sense. So a lot of times what happens with, at least in what we have observed, is when you're using a third-party solution, there remains this boundary between audio engine and game engine. But the benefit we have is because sort of audio engine and game engine, they're just part of the same existing code base. The amount of leverage you have in communicating between scene geometry, for example, or the material system, or passing parameters from game engine on the audio engine side, that's incredibly high, because we don't have to worry about this is just some standalone thing which lives outside of the whole game engine ecosystem in some sense. And to what Dave said, like it's because we have sort of full end-to-end control. It's super easy to just go in there and sort of add a feature, whether it's a DSP or whether it's hooking up something into the game engine logic, which communicates with the audio engine in a way that would require a lot more sort of twisting and turning to make it work if we had a completely different tool to use. So it's significantly powerful audio engine that we have in Source 2 in itself. So there's like sort of a less of a reason to use anything else at the moment.
And I can add a little bit to that. One of the things we learnt, I think, way back in Half-Life 2, was that if we can empower individual disciplines to sort of go as far as they can in improving the experience in the game without needing other people to get involved, or being gated by a programmer or something like that, then we find that we get significantly better outcomes. Like, not only do we get more work from those disciplines, but their work tends to be better because they can iterate faster, and they can solve their own problems. And so we've for years, we've sort of at an engine level tried to create these as much as we can ways for disciplines to just sort of add content to the end without being gated. And so sound, I think, is just another example of where I think with Alyx, we saw this enormous payoff in empowering them to control sound in as many ways as they possibly could without necessarily always needing programmers. It also helps that almost all the sound folks are all various degrees of programmers themselves and can solve lots of stuff. And so I think that, coupled with the way that they all sort of embed themselves heavily into the game team, results in sound having this super tight connection to the game experience. They can do things like say, I want the sound of this ambient sound or this piece of music. I want to adjust it based upon the distance between the player and the nearest enemy. I want this to increase in some or change in some way as they see the zombie get closer and closer to them, and be able to do that kind of have that kind of control where they get to write essentially small bits of code or script associated with every sound and control it in some way that improves the way that sound is connected to the experience the player is having. I think was a really important part of how we got the sound in Alyx to the sort of level of being that sort of that first-class citizen.
And I am back from the nether. Apologies again for falling off. We're actually a little bit post time. I would like to thank all of our panelists for coming and joining us. Please, everyone, applaud and love. Applause and love abound. We are actually at a coffee break. So your task right now, should you choose to accept it, is to stand up here from your computer, run to your kitchen, get some hot water and tea or coffee or maybe a little snack, and then please come join us back in the AVAR lobby. Hopefully our Valve speakers will be able to continue to join us there as well and continue the conversation. And we are on coffee break from now until 11:30. So thank you all, Valve speakers, for joining us. Thanks so much to our Valve panelists and to Joy from Harmon as well for joining us and having such a great conversation. And again, looking forward to seeing the rest of you around the rest of the AVAR conference.